Welcome to Conscious Conversations, a place where East meets West, a place where conversations and ideas will challenge your minds, expand your consciousness, awaken your heart, and make you think more deeply about yourself and the world.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to Conscious Conversations. I'm Anthony Profeta here with co-host Wes Gordon. How are you doing today, Wes?
Very good.
Good. You have a good week?
Yes, I did.
Good. So we have a very interesting topic today that might actually flow over. We really don't know where this is going to lead because it's such a broad, so much information and so much sort of ways we could sort of dissect what we're going to talk about today. But we're really talking about this idea of how did we get here? Now, all traditions around the world, they do say that where we're at right now isn't the true reality. It's not our real home, that we're trying to get back to some place that we've sort of maybe fallen from or come out of. And
Right.
So all the different traditions say that that is really the case. And this is just sort of a temporary spot that we're in. And so we thought that we'd converse a little bit about this. Now, from an Eastern perspective, they believe that, at least some Buddhists, please remember that every religion and faith actually has many different sects, schools, and belief systems within it. It's just not like Christianity that's broken up into all these different sects. Jews have different branches. Buddhism has different branches. Hinduism has different branches. So when I'm talking about Buddhists, this doesn't go across the board. Or when I talk about Hindus, it doesn't go across the board. But many of the Buddhists believe that we are a stream of consciousness that has come out of a pure undefiled consciousness that they call the pure mind, clear light mind, and now we're here due to some karmic defilements. And within the Hindu tradition, they believe that in the beginning was Brahman, this formless consciousness, this energy, and then there became the individuation of consciousness, or the one broke up into all these little droplets, which are what we are, these little droplets from an ocean of consciousness, and now we're here and trying to work our way back to merge back into that ocean again. But in the main three Western religions, the Abrahamic faiths, they believe that there was something that happened known as, mostly this term comes from the Christian faith, but known as the fall. And it's a interpretation of the book of Genesis in which, we were in a garden, and all three of the Abrahamic faiths believe this. And then somehow we were cast out of that garden of paradise and in some way expelled from it. And we're on our way that through the grace of God, we can be brought back into God's presence again. And while some people may believe this is myth or truth, it doesn't matter to me which way you see it. But I do believe that there is so much that could be said just by looking at this. And whether you think it's a myth or not, there's still great value to trying to read it, interpreting it. And there is so much that this can actually teach us, maybe from a spiritual or even a moral perspective. But what is your take on this whole idea of Genesis and the fall and how we got here?
Oh Lord, if you're going by the Bible, the King James version, it's like I read the first two chapters over again this morning just because of this.
First two chapters alone, there's so much that we can talk about right there.
There's so many different little things, nuances with the wording and how it was presented. And
absolutely,
if you're going to study this, you definitely need to go to the concordance and go to the root word meanings and find out what those words actually meant in their original form.
I agree.
Because we're getting it in, I guess, a King James version, a more English written form.
And to be honest, by the time we get it, it's actually gone through many translations. It goes from the ancient Hebrew or Aramaic to the Greek to the English. So there's many different times a certain word is actually changed.
Right.
And so by the time it does get to us, sometimes the meaning is not true or literal to what it was first written in.
Exactly. And I can see why everyone's confused. I mean, these two chapters alone will throw you in a tailspin just logically if you read them. It's like, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense on a lot of levels, but parts of it could make a lot of sense depending on how you interpreted it.
Yes.
So you just come away from it going, what happened? Like, how did we get here? Oh, boy.
Because if you do go to the Genesis 1 and 2, some say there are actually two creation stories. Well, there are if you read them, but they say they're actually two different ones. They're not talking about the same creation.
Right. And, for me, I sum it up on a quick level. It seems like we came in, somehow we were in a spiritual, pristine state,
Right.
undefiled.
Right.
And we're what they call it in the Eden,
Yes.
which is that perfect
The
place.
paradise, yeah.
And we were going to be allowed to stay there. But then for some reason, along comes this serpent, along comes the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil that are in the garden. And I'm not quite sure what trees actually are. I haven't looked up the root words of those. Because when it says, don't eat of this tree of knowledge of good and evil, well, they didn't know they were naked. So when they ate it, oh, wait a minute, I need clothes.
Right.
But then they say, don't let them have anything else in the garden. Don't let them eat the tree of life.
Because then they'll become like gods.
They could become like gods. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's plural. What do you mean gods?
Yeah.
I thought there was just one. So there's more confusion. And then I'm like, well, if it was a tree of life, what were they breathing through their nose? I thought they were alive. That has to have. So, I got a whole lot more questions.
Well, you bring up a very good question right now. If you do read the first chapter of Genesis, you see that God speaks in plural. And even the name that is given to God in the first chapter of Genesis is called God. But it's a translation of Elohim. And Elohim actually is a plural in its vernacular. So it's God in plural. Now, some scholars and theologians, they say, well, that's because God is talking to the Word. So it's God and the Word that's there in the beginning. But there are also some scholars that say if you read the book of Proverbs and if you read some of the other books, there's a figure known as Sophia, or wisdom, and it's a feminine aspect, and it says that she is with God in the beginning at the foundations of the earth. So some say it's God talking to the Word in Sophia, the Word in wisdom, and that's why in the first chapter of Genesis, God is speaking in plural, and let's make them like us. So let's give them wisdom and, insight and all these sort of things. Now, when we get to the second one, it's Lord. And so God's name at that point becomes Yahweh, or Yahweh Elohim sometimes. And so it goes from God to Lord. So there are two different names in reference to God in just those two chapters alone. But some scholars say that's why it's speaking in plural.
Wow. Because, the first chapter says God, God, God. The second one says Lord God,
Yes.
Lord God.
Yes.
As if it was a different something doing this.
Yes.
Then you just brought up something about the Word. And I was fast forward to 1 John.
Right.
And it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And some people try to say that was Christ at that point.
The Logos. So the Logos and Sophia, they say were with God in the beginning, and that's why in the first chapter it's talking in plural. But there is another esoteric teaching in which God's talking in plural, because in that moment, all spirits, all souls, however you want to think of that, are sort of being created and made, and so it's in a multi sort of conscious level at that point too. But that's a little bit of a reach and a deeper one. I think the idea of a logos and maybe Sophia being with God because the scriptures say that might make it more understandable. But there's also, just in the first chapter alone, there's and the second, there's some interesting things that we can learn about this whole idea of how we got here, and that is that the first chapter, when God's creating the world in the 7 days, it's like there's an order out of chaos, and it's his word that brings order to this chaos. So he speaks forth and calls forth the animals and the sea animals and life and all of this. So he's creating order out of this spirit and waters that are there. But what also begins to play over is then man and his creation begins to bring order out of chaos through his word. So man now then begins to give names to all these animals that are all over the earth. So it's like what is in heaven is on earth, and like as it is in heaven, as it is in earth sort of thing. And so there's these orders of chaos that are just in those two little things alone. But where this really gets interesting in the first two chapters is a movement from a spiritual creation to the physical creation. And many say that's why there are two different creation stories. So the first one does say, let's make God in our image and likeness. Let's make man in our image and likeness. Male and female, he made them. But then we go to the second chapter, and it says he formed man out of the dust of the earth and blew the breath of life into him.
Yes.
But now there's still only man at
Right.
this point, Adam. Now, some say the first creation is when he says male and female, he made them, okay? They were made as spiritual beings with both genders in one sort of body. Oneness. There's a unity of the opposites. There's a unities of poles, the male and female, the yin and yang. There's the opposites within that wholeness. So he made them male and female in the beginning in the spiritual form one. Then when we get to the second chapter and he makes Adam, he sees that Adam's sort of lonely and the animals aren't really doing it for him. So he puts a sleep on Adam and then creates Eve out of Adam. Now, the interpretation, the word that is translated is rib. It says he takes the rib and creates Eve from that. However, if you go back to the original word from which it is translated, it actually translates into side.
Interesting.
He takes the side of man and creates woman. So now the two that were in one body are split. And some say that's the creation of our physicality, our physical nature, but that's also a movement from spirituality, oneness, to duality in this physical world. So there's the creation of duality, but we'll talk more about this, I think, when we come back from the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Conscious Conversations. We're here talking about how we actually got here, and we're talking about more of the three Abrahamic perspectives of this idea of coming into the fall, and how when God first created us, there's two different creation stories, and the first one was a spiritual one, and then moving into the second one where he actually split male and female was the understanding from an esoteric or deep mystical teaching that that was the creation of this world of duality. But some will say, but wait a minute, what's about eating of this fruit? What does this all mean?
Right.
So what is your take on them eating of the tree of good and evil? Because some say the tree of good and evil is duality.
It's duality. Yeah, that was the storyline that I got. That was the thing that they did that broke them, and then they could see that they were naked.
Yes.
Not the energies of the sexual split, like you're talking about.
The genders, yes.
So yeah, eating from the tree. I mean.
Yeah. Now, some people say that what happened was in the first split, when they were male and female still living in the garden, they weren't awake to the consciousness of duality. They were split, but still living from a spiritual level of consciousness. And then what happens is they get tempted by this serpent or snake. They eat of the fruit. And then what does it say after that? Their eyes are open.
Right.
And they become aware of their nakedness and they hide themselves.
Right.
Some say that that is the moment that the consciousness of duality actually entered into our level of consciousness. So when we were first split, we're still living as these spiritual, high evolutionary consciousness beings who still see oneness. So when they were split, Adam saw Eve as coming from his side. He said he was made from man. So they saw each other as one. They saw each other as from each other. They recognized that the life within me is the same life within you, and the life within Adam is the same life within Eve. And they recognized that oneness. They were still living from a level of oneness. When they ate the fruit, the consciousness of duality stepped into them. And now that's why they recognize their nakedness, because they were naked before.
Yeah.
So what does this mean? They recognized their nakedness and they hid themselves from God. Well, what this means is that they recognized a separation. They recognized the duality of God and other, of me and other. And what happened in that essence was they fell from a level of God consciousness, oneness, to a level of self-consciousness. Their eyes were open. They recognized their self was naked.
Right.
And in that self-consciousness, it's seeing the dualistic perspective of there's me and then there's everything else. And also, when we become self-conscious, we become vulnerable. So many people say that they recognize their vulnerability of being naked. And so the level of duality was that fall into self-consciousness. Prior to eating the apple, or whatever fruit it was, they weren't self-aware.
Okay. That brings up, the narrator brings up more questions as you read this.
Yes.
Because it says, oh, wait a minute, we got to do something about this. Don't let them eat the tree of life or they'll become as us.
Excellent.
So now you're telling me that God understands duality and always did.
Yes, and he knew that this would happen. He knew that this choice would happen. So some say, well, what's this whole idea of them eating the fruit? Why is this so bad? Well, some say that it's just a superficial statement of that there's a law in God's universe, there's laws of God, and when we transgress them, we must pay a consequence. That's plain and simple the way it is. So eating the apple was just a thing that there is law, and God's law that we must follow. When we don't do that, we sin. We miss the mark. Okay? And so some people just say that it's just a simple story about not following the law of God. And when we do, we pay the consequence of being separated from that God consciousness, that oneness consciousness. Now, others say that eating the fruit was actually a symbol of us following our selfish desires. We saw something, we desired it, and we selfishly said, I want that. I don't care that God said, don't do it.
We disobeyed.
We disobeyed, and the love for that thing was greater than our love and devotion to God, that our selfishness caused the separation. So rather than being selfless and loving, we tuned into a impulse of selfishness, and that's what sort of separated us. Now, what's also interesting is that it says that in that day you eat it, you shall surely die. Mm. Well, Adam didn't die, and Eve didn't die right after eating the apple. So what does this mean? If God told them they would die, now some scholars...
Yeah, the 1,000-year thing.
Some scholars say, as Peter said, that one day is 1,000 years. And in God's eyes, 1,000 years is one day. So he did die within 1,000 years because he died after 900 and something years. However, the deeper esoteric and mystical traditions say no. He did die immediately when he ate the fruit. And Eve died. The death was the spiritual death of moving from oneness to dualistic consciousness and now feeling separated from God. That was the death. So he did die in that moment.
Okay.
So there is a mystical interpretation that that is the death that is being referred to. Now, this whole idea of going back to eat of the tree of
life,
eternal life.
Yeah.
Here's interesting. Many people say, well, if that was the case, if they disobeyed God, threw them out, why didn't he just destroy this garden? I mean, he could have did it. He wiped out the whole damn world years later with the flood. Why not just destroy the garden right then and there so they can't get back? Why put a guard there to protect from eating that
flaming turning sword?
Because in mythology, there's a guardian figure that is always meant to be overcome. And he didn't destroy the garden because subconsciously, our goal is to get back there. It's still there for us to reach. We can still become spiritual beings if we eat of the tree of life, but we got to put in the work. We got to do what's necessary in order to overcome the obstacles in the way to getting back and retaining that oneness, that spiritual level of consciousness, and regain that understanding of who we truly are. So the garden's still there for us to enter.
But if that was the tree of life,
right?
What life did they have in them at that time?
Well, they had a level of consciousness that was no longer God consciousness, Christ consciousness, Shiva consciousness, Buddha nature consciousness.
But before they ate the fruit, what life was in them? See, I go at this really logical.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Once they were split, they said they were living in duality with a sense of oneness.
Right.
But I think they didn't know at that point the consciousness of being separated. So now when they come back with a different understanding. So it's like angels who have never had a physical experience, right? They've never had a body. They don't know what it's like to feel the separation of God. So now when we come back to God consciousness again, we know what it's like to sort of not have it.
Right.
And so we come back with a totally different level of conscious understanding that they didn't have before the fall. So that would be one interpretation of that.
Okay.
Okay, but these are deep questions.
Very
these
deep.
are very. We can spiral. This is probably going to be a two-part
Easily
talk that we're going to be doing, because there's so much more that we can talk about in this.
Yeah.
And it's really a very.
Are you
deep
confused? You're not alone if you're confused.
Right. And so, but what did they say? How do we get back? Well, they would say that we sort of get back through love.
Yes.
Love is the way. Love is the key. Love is the path. So that is the way. Selflessness, thinking about the greater good of others rather than just our selfish desires, just our sensual pleasures, just us. So no longer me, 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 but we. And that those would be some of the ways. And also, some say that the eating the fruit. Another factor that falls into that is spiritual pride. We wanted to be like God. And so becoming less prideful and understanding that we are, in essence, part and parcel with God. We share the qualities, image and likeness, but to be like God would be sort of prideful. Or as God. Yeah. But I think we need to stop here. This went by so fast today. But I love these conversations. I thank you all for listening. We do want to thank our sponsor. So we are now currently being sponsored by the Ancient Healings Conference that's going to be in the Melbourne Auditorium in Melbourne, Florida on July 10th and 11th. So please join us there. Come there. There's going to be about 30 vendors or more and wonderful speakers. It's 2 full days. And to learn more, please visit the ancienthealingsconference.com. ancienthealingsconference.com. You could get tickets there. You could learn more. Or if you want to be a vendor or if you want to be a speaker, please call 321-543-8882. Once again, we thank you all for tuning in today. Please leave your comments below. Let us think about what's your perspective on how we got here. What does the fruit mean to you? What does the tree mean to you? Do you see 2 creation stories in the first 2 chapters of the Bible if you read that? Or if you come from Eastern perspectives, what is your perspective and take on how we got here and how do we get back? So thank you again. We love you all dearly, and we hope that each and every one of your days is truly filled with an abundance of love, happiness, and peace. See you again next Wednesday. Bye-bye.